this is my history of functional neuroimaging in 3 easy steps. I think there are basically 3 phases of development that it's useful to keep in mind to understand how we got from, a time as recent as 1980. I mean, lots of us were alive then and studying psychology and studying the brain, and having to rely on these older methods like the lesion method. And it's all very, very recently that functional neuroimaging became a source of information on brain function. So the first real breakthrough came in the 80s when people started using imaging, in this case PET, which is a different technique to do basically the same thing that fMRI does. They instead of just showing that if you put a visual stimulus in front of a person and have them open their eyes, that you get activation back here in the visual parts of the brain, and if you make noises, you get activation in the auditory parts of the brain, you have them wiggle their fingers, you get motor activation. People, basically a neurologist at Washington University, Mark Rakel, who was very influential in developing PET, teamed up with a cognitive psychologist, Mike Posner, and designed studies using PET that broke down not just the type of stimulus that was being processed, but the kinds of psychological processes that people were engaged in at different points in analyzing the stimulus. And as you can see from this, this is much like the Dehaan study that Marcel just showed. You get different patterns of activation depending on what people are doing when they look at a word. If they're just passively viewing it, you get activation back here. In fact, that agrees quite nicely with the area that Marcel showed activates just to words as a visual pattern. If you're listening to words, you get auditory activation and so forth, speaking, motor activation, generating words, up here in the frontal lobes where all this kind of higher level cognition happens. So this was the first big breakthrough, actually being able to isolate mental processes as opposed to just overall response to a stimulus. The second big step forward happened, roughly speaking, about a decade later. We can kind of divide this up into decades, when people expanded out the domain of psychological processes that they were studying with functional imaging, from sort of nuts and bolts information processing, vision, hearing, reading, language, memory, to the more kind of warm and fuzzy aspects of psychology, mood, feelings, affect, personality. This, I think, is particularly important for what we're talking about tonight, because these are the domains of psychological processes that really have the more obvious social and ethical implications. And this is an early study by Richie Davidson at Wisconsin showing, again, activation in the amygdala. So contrary to sort of the assumption of one of the questions that was asked earlier, there is emerging agreement across studies of what areas are activated with what kinds of tasks. Finally, I think the most recent trend that's ethically and socially relevant is that we can now begin to do studies of individual subjects. The 2 slides I showed you before, many of the slides that Marcel showed you, were based on data collected from groups of subjects. And basically, people would average together data from groups of subjects because the methods weren't sensitive enough to get anything meaningful out of an individual subject. And so to sort of pull out the signal and let the noise kind of average out and drop away, you needed to scan a whole group of people. But as the methods improved, particularly with functional MRI, people began to not look at whole samples, but look at individual people and how they differed from one another. And this is a slide that, in fact, just came off our computer about a week ago, showing the parts of the brain that vary according to the early childhood, the nature of the early childhood experience that somebody had. These are scans of adolescents, and we had longitudinally collected data about their early home lives, and we looked at the way in which adolescent brain function differed according to whether they had more or less cognitive stimulation as children, and more or less parental nurturance and warmth and kind of supportive parenting. And this is, as you see, you get hippocampal and some orbital frontal areas associated with early parental nurturance. So this tells us something about not the average person, but variation among people, or between people. So the applications of this sort of imaging are what we're interested in here tonight. And I'm going to actually skip over the clinical applications, because I think Marcel gave a much better explication of them than I could have. But I'm going to talk a little bit about forensic applications. How do you find out what somebody really knows? Are they holding out on you? Are they trying to deceive you? How do you know what really happened? And also a sort of emerging field in functional imaging of just trying to understand normal folk. How does a normal person's brain work, and how do normal people vary from one another? Even within the category normal, there's a lot of variation. People come in different flavors. People are smarter or dumber, more or less conscientious, and so forth. And there's all kinds of domains in society where we're interested in that kind of information. Employers spend a lot of time, HR departments, and trying to, give personality tests, classify people, figure out what they have an aptitude for. In the education system, we spend a lot of time testing, more now than ever, assessment, and just all variety of ways in which somebody out there might want to know about you and your brain. Let's talk about a few different forensic applications. These obviously have application in the criminal justice system. They also have application in employment situations. In fact, most polygraph testing is actually done for employment screening, not for legal proceedings. And finally, these days, with everybody worried about homeland security and the war on terror, there's a lot of interest in the government in ways of, figuring out, is what's different about Osama bin Laden's brain, as somebody asked earlier, and is there a way to scan somebody's brain and decide, are they a threat, are they a terrorist, are they lying about their knowledge of, terror training camps and so forth? So let me just walk you through a few examples. The first one is lie detection. This is from a recent paper, headed up by this fellow who's a colleague at Penn, in which people were induced to either tell the truth or tell lies repeatedly. And he used a very novel set of statistical techniques. He's actually a statistician. Analyzing over a large number of trials which brain areas distinguish best between truth-telling and lying. And then he was able to take the same method and test new subjects and have them either tell the truth or lie, and classify on an individual level who was telling the truth and who was lying between 85 and 90% of the time correctly, which is pretty astonishing. So in answer to the question, how accurate is it? Well, in this laboratory task, it's, I think, shockingly accurate. On the other hand, it's a laboratory task. You're lying about what card you're looking at or what card is in an envelope you're holding. In the real world, people are lying about all kinds of things, and you don't have the luxury of doing multiple trials and crunching, huge numbers of statistics over multiple people to see, which brain areas are going to distinguish for you. So I think just, the bottom line here is that it's probably more accurate. It's certainly more accurate than I ever would have guessed you could get in predicting for a new person whether they're lying or not based on these studies of earlier people. Okay, but basically not ready for prime time. This is not going to be any use at the airport to tell who's got a bomb in their luggage. Okay. Another interesting forensic application is to detect what's called false memory. You can think of this as a kind of unintentional lie. This is when an eyewitness, for example, truly believes that they saw somebody there or saw something happen, and they're just honestly mistaken about it. Discriminating what's false memory from what's true veridical memory is a real problem for eyewitness testimony. And it turns out that whereas the hippocampus, an area that, as Marcel was saying, is crucial for memory, treats a false memory, a veridical memory in red, and a false memory in orange equivalently, and distinguishes them from the blue line, which is the fMRI response to something that the person doesn't think they saw. This other slightly more posterior place, the parahippocampal gyrus, does distinguish between a veridical memory in red and the false memory in orange. So in principle, maybe you could use a brain scan focusing on the parahippocampal gyrus to distinguish what the owner of the brain can't distinguish. That is, whether it really was something that they saw or not. Again, I think we can say that this is not ready for prime time. These kinds of data come from, grand averages over many subjects and many items, and you can't make it work if it's just, this one face, have you seen it before, one person. Finally, there's another EEG-based method for basically detecting deception. It's based on guilty knowledge, that is, knowledge that only the perpetrator of the crime would have. And it's, again, the same basic idea of looking to see whether, that's the right button, whether an innocent person should recognize objects that are well known to be related to the crime, but not objects that only the perpetrator would know. To an innocent person, they would be equivalent to the green line, that is, unrelated, objects that are unrelated to the crime. Whereas for the guilty party, both the commonly known to be related to the crime items in pink and the uniquely known to the perpetrator items in blue will be all register as familiar. And just to let you know, this method actually has been admitted as evidence in a murder trial. The man who developed it, Larry Farwell, is in business selling it to companies who want to be able to question their employees and, try to get a handle on whether or not they're telling the truth. And it's been touted as, again, a possible, tool in the war on terror. Again, there's a lot of limitations. There have not been the kind of at least published studies that would tell you whether this is reliable. So again, I think we have to say not ready for prime time. What's probably of most interest to people here, or at least what's most likely to influence our own lives, assuming you're not out there committing crimes, is all the different ways in which brain imaging can tell us about ourselves as normal people. This includes the measurement of ability, various kinds of abilities, whether it's to be an orthopedic surgeon or a neurologist or whatever, personality, interest, motivation, what you like, value, I guess, as we just heard it called, and also attitudes. So I'm going to just walk you through a few examples of studies that have been done showing that brain imaging is already able to give us a crude measure of these traits in normal people. So first of all, this picture down here illustrates areas that correlate with an individual's fluid intelligence. Fluid intelligence, sometimes called little g, is kind of your problem-solving intelligence. It's kind of how quickly you can come up with solutions to novel problems. And obviously it's, predictive of work and school success. And you get a not bad correlation between that and activation in these areas, these frontal lobe areas, which again are important for higher level cognition, and some back here, temporal cortex, when people are solving simple problems. It's also true that you can now scan young children in simple language tasks, not even reading tasks, because these are pre-literate kids, but just tasks of like rhyming words, and predict their later reading ability. I just heard a talk at the Society for Neuroscience last week showing some fairly impressive correlations with kids followed longitudinally this way. And you know how nervous every middle class parent is about, their kid doing well in kindergarten and, becoming a good reader and hooked on phonics, makes millions of dollars. Well, we could, the ad next to the hooked on phonics ad, one of these days maybe, come in and have your kid scanned and we will be able to predict, if there's going to be any trouble lying ahead. Do you need to hire a tutor for him now? Whatever. Finally, spatial ability is another cognitive skill that has some real-world importance. I have a terrible sense of direction. Some people, actually even my daughter, has a much better sense of direction. And it turns out that that same part of the brain that the London taxi drivers show hypertrophy in, the hippocampus, which is important for learning, but particularly spatial learning. That is an area where you see differences between people who are good and bad with spatial navigation. Okay, personality. Again, I was very surprised when I read these results. This is from Turhan Canley's work. Traits like neuroticism, the sort of Woody Allen personality, kind of looking on the gloomy side of everything, spending a lot of time worrying about what might go wrong, that a trait like that would be related in systematic ways to brain activation, in fact, fairly strongly related. Okay, well, this graph shows the correlation in this area here, in the amygdala, between extroversion, which is the trait of tending to kind of seek out and pay attention to positive, pleasant things, to be sociable, look for company, new experiences, and so forth. There is, quite a high correlation, 0.7, which for a psychologist is like fantastic correlation in behavioral studies. 0.7 is really, really good. 0.9, people start to suspect you're faking your data. Well, in these brain imaging studies, you not uncommonly see correlations of 0.9 with psychological traits. Similarly, empathy and persistence also have neural correlates. Finally, interests. This is, you could sort of use this as a synonym for, values. What do you value? All kinds of things, including sexual preferences. This is a study that showed people explicit sexual pictures, and when it was of the right kind of person, the amygdala lights up. Okay, again, this is a very evolutionary old part of the brain that's involved in drives and motivation and so forth. You could, conceivably put somebody in a scanner, show them various kinds of pictures, and infer their sexual orientation. Finally, another potentially, sort of dicey trait to be scanning somebody for, conceivably somewhat of a threat to privacy, is implicit racial attitudes. So Liz Phelps and other labs as well at this point have shown that when a person is just looking passively at pictures of other people, and you have people of more than one race, you have black faces and white faces, that the amount of activation you see, again, in the amygdala, this is an area that's very important in kind of affective processing, that the discrepancy in the amygdala in your response to black faces relative to white, if you're a white subject, correlates with various other kind of subtle behavioral measures of your racial attitudes. And in particular, the more negative your automatic evaluation of an other race face, the more amygdala activation. So again, talking about like employment screening, would you want to scan, applicants to the police academy in a paradigm like this? Would you want to just say, look, we're just, testing to see how good your face memory is, because of course an officer of the law has to remember who he's dealing with. You could totally obscure the fact that you're finding out about their racial attitudes. It could be a useful method, but it also raises privacy issues. So just to sort of quickly recap where we've gotten to, like what are the current capabilities of brain imaging? Well, I think the answer is that pretty much, I'm going to leave myself a little wiggle room, but pretty much any cognitive or affective, emotional process of interest has some sort of brain imaging correlate. And yeah, so I think, basically there's nothing that we couldn't at least set about trying to measure. Of course, let me just also point out that the goal of most of this work is not measurement, okay? The goal of most of this work that I presented to you is basic science. It's trying to understand what parts of the brain working together with one another, enable us to solve problems, develop relationships, change our attitudes, and so forth. But from an ethical point of view and from a privacy point of view, one concern is, can we use these methods to measure people and to measure them covertly so they don't know they're being measured? And I think the bottom line here right now is we are amazingly close in the sense that we have found correlates of deceit. We found correlates of personality. We found correlates of sexual orientation. However, I think what we have to recognize is that in all these cases, they have not been demonstrated to be accurate, reliable measurement tools. And in fact, in most cases, based on the data we have now, the current methods are pretty clearly not accurate, reliable measurement tools. But I do think that there's enough data that it demonstrates the feasibility, so that if Big Brother does want to start measuring these things, it's probably doable in many cases. So the ethical issues here are, as I've already mentioned, privacy, but really privacy on a different level from what we usually think of when we talk about privacy, because it's really privacy of like your own thoughts. As far as you're not communicating anything, you're not telling anybody anything, showing anybody anything, and yet they are able to infer things about your mind, your attitudes, your beliefs, your preferences, and so forth. I think an equally important ethical issue to keep in mind, and maybe for the present moment more important than the privacy concern, is that imaging seems really high-tech, really scientific. People think it's very objective. If you see it in the brain image, it must be real. And I think we're at risk for over-reliance on what brain imaging tells us. And I think we have to be really, really careful that we, think this through carefully, that we know exactly what it is we're measuring, we know how well it generalizes to real-world situations as opposed to laboratory situations, and so forth. There already is a certain amount of snake oil being sold out there. I mentioned the brain fingerprinting method of Larry Farwell. There is, although Marcel repeated several times, functional neuroimaging is not useful currently as a diagnostic method. There is a psychiatrist, Daniel Amen, who has a couple of clinics, for-profit clinics, where he scans people to diagnose them with various kinds of psychiatric problems. And although I'm not an expert on this myself, I'm told by my colleagues who are psychiatrists and work on the kinds of problems that he purports to diagnose that his methods are really unproven. Yes, so I think we're very vulnerable as a society, kind of thinking, science is truth, science is objectivity, to think that if we find something out by brain imaging, that it must really be, solid, we can bank on it. And I think that's, at this point, not true diagnostically. It's not true with these forensic methods, and it really could, it could screw up people's lives if if your parents get some brain scan on you when you're 5 years old and start to worry that you're not going to learn to read, write, and whatever. So, in conclusion, brain imaging, along with several other neurotechnologies, which we haven't talked about here tonight, but maybe in a few years, you'll do another public outreach on neuroscience, and we can talk about them, things like psychopharmacology, deep brain stimulation, transcranial magnetic stimulation. All of these different methods of monitoring and manipulating the brain are undoubtedly going to have widespread effects in coming decades. And what we need to sort of meet the challenges of these new methods is well-informed discussion among scientists, policymakers, and the public. And actually, for that reason, I think it's just wonderful that such a large group showed up on a weeknight to hear talks about brain imaging. And finally, I just want to make a little plug for a new society that, in fact, Lori Zoloth in the audience here and I and a bunch of our colleagues have started, the Neuroethics Society, to discuss these kinds of problems. And you can find it on the web at neuroethicssociety.org. We also have an informational website on neuroethics that includes a lot of work on neuroimaging at Penn, and that URL is there too. So thank you.
Thank you, Martha. Other questions for Dr. Farah in the back?
You mentioned some future potential possibilities of using this in HR and whatnot. Do you see the ability to use brain imaging to measure compatibility between people for relationships and work environments?
Okay, so the question is, could you use brain imaging to try to do matchmaking, right? To assess who's a compatible partner for whom. First of all, I wouldn't be at all surprised if somebody, set up shop to try to do that. I guess insofar as assessments of personality can predict compatibility, then these brain imaging measures of personality would do at least that well. There actually is a website called, I think it's called chemistry.com, or does anybody know this one? It's a matchmaking website. It doesn't actually, ask you for a brain scan, but it does ask you a lot of questions that are supposed to, they're supposed to find out certain things about your brain and match you up with a potential partner based on that. For example, they ask you, to look at your second finger and your fourth finger and to see which one is longer. And the second to fourth digit ratio is believed by some people to be sensitive to how much testosterone you were exposed to prenatally, which not only affects your finger length ratio, but also affects certain brain characteristics. And in fact, people who have higher levels of testosterone exposure in the womb do grow up to have certain interests and personality traits and so forth. So they don't scan you, but they try to get at your brain function in other ways.
Getting at your brain function through the fingers, yes, in the back.
People in national security are trained to beat lie detectors, and I'm just wondering if there's been any experimentation on whether people can beat brain scans.
You're not talking into the mic.
Oh, I know, but it...
Okay, I'll repeat it. So the question is anybody doing research on the possibility of beating a brain scan-based lie detector? I mean, there's various ways of trying to foil conventional polygraph lie detection, other kinds of lie detection methods. And, I don't know. Does Marcel know the answer? Yeah. I mean, it wouldn't surprise me if people were trying that, but I just, I guess the term is countermeasures, or, have people investigated whether there are countermeasures that a liar could take to a brain scan, and I just don't know. Yeah.
I can give an answer to that. My field is lie detection. And there is one particular kind of countermeasure, which I will not reveal, which is extraordinarily productive in beating the polygraph. And I have no idea if it would also have the same capability with brain scan imaging. But there are some very potent countermeasures.
Just as long as, I mean, that's a useful observation, and as long as we're talking about the lie detection brain scans, one thing that you should know about lie detection brain scans is, the areas that light up, I mean, it's a little different in each study, which is concerning, because, again, following up on a question earlier, you want to kind of believe you're converging on some sort of fairly simple picture of how things are working, and not that, for every type of lie or for every context in which you're lying, some other part of the brain is involved. To the extent that there is some kind of, generalization possible across studies, the basic finding is that prefrontal areas light up more when you're lying than when you're telling the truth. And there's kind of a simple interpretation for that makes it all seem very anticlimactic, which is just that it's a little more effortful to tell a lie than to tell the truth. I mean, when you're telling the truth, you're just kind of calling it like it is, right? When you're telling a lie, you have to sort of say, okay, well, this is the way it is, but I'm going to say it some other way, and so you're getting this extra frontal activation because it is a little bit more effortful. And I think that's relevant to the question of countermeasures, just because, maybe if you practice a lot, become very skilled, you could work your way around a brain-based lie detector.
Yes.
Will there ever be any applications, sort of like stem cell research or something, where corrections could be made in the brains of like autistic children or something?
Well, so the thing about brain imaging is it's basically just, a way of measuring. It doesn't actually do anything to your brain. However, it can, just as a basic research tool, it can suggest therapies that could be tried. And actually, a beautiful example of this comes from the work of Helen Mayberg, a psychiatrist at, I believe she's at Emory. Anybody know? Anyway, Helen Mayberg is the name, and she had done a lot of imaging on patients with depression, and found very consistently that a certain part of the anterior cingulate cortex, way up in front of the brain, was abnormally active. And so she tried a completely novel therapeutic approach with a small number of patients who, basically felt they had nothing to lose because they had tried, umpteen antidepressant medications, they tried ECT, just nothing was helping them. What she did was work with a surgeon to actually have an electrode put in that part of the brain and have the electrode turned on and deliver a little pulsating, electric stimulation to sort of regulate the activity of that part of the brain. And the early results have been spectacular, just spectacular. The sort of the anecdote I heard was that, with one of the patients, they after surgery, the thing was implanted, they turned it on, and he said something like, oh my God, it's a new day. I've got my life back again. I just suddenly feel so good. And then they turned it off, and he was like, oh no, I don't. I feel terrible again. So that is, from what I've heard, a really stunning example of how brain imaging can suggest new therapies.
It seems to me that one of the issues in brain imaging, and I don't really know, is the variability from observer to observer, that the mood of the observer and his skill or her skill in eliciting this information is as important as the information trying to be elicited. Is that? I mean, there has to be a variation in the ability of people to interpret these scans.
Well, yeah.
And also, not only to interpret, but to elicit the responses that you're trying to elicit.
Well, I mean, I would agree with both of those things. I think they're very different, though. So basically, I mean, interpreting the scans is what do I want to say? Eliciting the responses, let's say, is part art, part science. Okay, and that really involves like designing a task that contrasts the right conditions to really bring out the particular, to isolate the particular mental process you want to study or whatever. And that is definitely part art, part science. Interpretation, I guess I'm inclined to say no. That's not art, and in fact, when it gets too artsy, you worry, because I mean, I think one of the drawbacks of imaging is that it's very easy to just look at these spots of color here, there, and everywhere, and just make up stories about them, and sort of tell just so stories. Like you see some activation in the left hemisphere, and you go, oh, well, you see what's happening is that people are covertly verbalizing, they're telling themselves a story about this thing, or if you see some right hemisphere activation, you say, oh well, people are visualizing something spatial now. And of course, yeah, I mean, left hemisphere activation could mean all kinds of things, not necessarily just language, ditto on the right. So people do sometimes get a little overly imaginative interpreting brain scans, but I think when it's done right, it's like interpreting any other kind of experimental data.
Yes, over here.
Yeah. You mentioned you're concerned about premature adoption, but one thing that's happened in many universities, including your own at Penn, is that researchers have gotten out and gotten patents and started commercial firms already to flaunt their technique on the open market, including to Homeland Security. And I'm wondering whether you think there should be different standards in different domains. What would constitute appropriate sort of standards of evidence for presentation of such information in, say, an employment setting versus a legal court versus what's acceptable in a peer review article? For example, Farwell, who you put up there, has very, very seldom published in peer review articles, and you began to say snake oil and then sort of got to him and then slipped away. But you seem to present all these graphs. One of the powers of the graphs is they all appear on your screen, and they all have a kind of equal validity to us as laymen. But in fact, there's very different sort of standards of proof invoked in the different kinds of images and in different domains of law, private security, and scientific peer-reviewed papers. And I'm wondering whether you really think an informed discussion is going to make any difference to that.
Well, I mean, I think the question of, what should the standard be to be able to use a method to make an inference, like to infer that somebody's lying, or to infer that somebody has guilty knowledge, or to infer that somebody's an extrovert, or is attracted to people of their own sex, or has good relations with other races, or whatever. I mean, that's I mean, for legal matters, I think there is a whole framework for dealing with that, and that's probably something that some lawyer in the audience will know about. I'm blocking on this. Is it McNaughton rule, or am I mixing that with something else? Anyway, you know, there are sort of guidelines for what constitutes kind of credible evidence for in a court of law. You're shaking your head that way, meaning.
Well, Farrell's evidence was accepted.
Well, yeah, it's true. So some judge in Idaho thought Iowa, sorry, thought. Thought it met that standard. But that raises an interesting question, which is, the understanding of these techniques by the legal community and by judges. And generally, judges don't know much about brain imaging. I mean, I think, at this point, they've all at least done, sort of DNA 101 and have some sense of the forensic potential of DNA evidence, but I think there's much less understanding about, the interpretation of brain images. The question of, how good does it have to be for diagnostic use, and how good does it have to be even just to, as a scientific experiment to test some hypothesis? I think that's much more of a sort of, consensual, if you can get it through peer review and then and other people replicate it, and, the sort of self-correcting process of science goes to work, and other people try to show you you're wrong, and they fail to, after a while it becomes accepted.